said, an incredible scholar, a brilliant activist, and someone over the past few months we've gotten to know to become friends, which is like a really nice thing to add to that list. And is in Dr. Jonathan Rosa. Dr. Rosa is a recently promoted associate professor, and you got tenure already, so that's always good, at Stanford University. Um, and I'll stop here because probably as we move through the conversation, we'll get to know more about Dr. Rosa's trajectory and journey and all of that. So I want to start the conversation first, and I'll throw a couple of questions, and then as we go, um, students will have questions to ask. So just to concept, I'll just start with a little bit of context. So this class that we're in the middle of, it's a class on bilingualism. So it's kind of like we call it bilingualism roundtable. So it's very casual. It's not like a formal course itself in of itself. It's more like um, it's more a course on looking at different trends or questions about bilingualism. And for this semester, the leading question I decided to bring to the class was um, kind of like, what's the role of the L1 in a second language classroom? Because that has been, I mean, you know, the history of bilingual education, and that has historically been a contentious issue. Should we let students speak Spanish in the English class, or vice versa, or should teachers resort to that? I mean, like, there is lots of schools of thought, and we have run through several ideas. I mean, we have looked at issues on bilingualism, biliteracy. We just recently talked about translanguage and encode switching, and then we just kind of bookended with the conversation on racial linguistics, and that's where we have you to talk about that today. So just after that little context, I wanted to start with that question, and I'm curious, more than, let's say, what racial linguistics is. We have read the literature. I'm more interested in the journey, your journey as a bilingual speaker, and how that journey kind of got you finally into developing the idea of racial linguistics.
Okay, so let me say a few things. I think the question about L1 or a first language or a native language in relation to bilingualism is something that, we try to make sense of in lots of different environments in terms of what are the specific languages that are relevant in a given context and what role should they play in organizing education in that space or organizing policy in that space. So in terms of protected rights or voting rights or, these different spaces, what kinds of language rights should someone have? And then we could think about what that looks like educationally. I think for me, part of what I've been trying to make sense of for some time is how categories like L1 or native language make language feel very straightforward. Those categories make language boundaries feel as though they're very straightforward, and named languages, we could have a list of named languages and we can figure out where each of them lives on a map in the world. And we tend to think that, okay, this language is used in this country or is used by this population. And so we tend to think that, we can map out where different languages naturally live in the world and who uses them, which populations use them naturally. And so part of what I've tried to do in terms of my work and in terms of my life is making sense of where those assumptions come from. How is it that we come to imagine language as living somewhere or on the map in some natural way? Why is it that we imagine certain people as naturally speaking certain languages? So who is understood as being a native speaker of what languages and why? And part of why I came to these questions is because growing up, I'm from New York. And so growing up in New York, in the United States, and I should say, My father is Puerto Rican, and my mother is Canadian, is Irish. And so my father's family came from Puerto Rico to New York City, and my mother's family came from Ireland to Canada, to the United States. And so both sides of my family are are migrants. And I use the word migrant, not immigrant, because in the United States, migrant and immigrant mean two different things. I could say more about that if it's useful at some point. But the reason I do note the difference between migrant and immigrant is because it's a legal distinction. So that to be an immigrant is to be framed as legally authorized to move across borders, whereas a migrant might have authorization to move across borders or not. But an immigrant is a legally acceptable. And then we could talk about how it is that certain people are made acceptable in certain spaces, certain languages are made acceptable in certain spaces, and you start to see what I'm thinking about. Why it is that, for example, my mother migrated to the United States from Canada, and my mother was a white woman, and she spoke English, and she never became a US citizen. Both of my parents are no longer living, they both passed away, so I'll talk about them in past tense a little bit, but my mother was a white woman who came to the United States. English was the only language she used, and she never became a citizen of the United States. And yet she was imagined as embodying Americanness, as being more American than my father ever could be. And so my father's family, who were born in Puerto Rico, all US citizens, because all Puerto Ricans are US citizens, because the United States imposed US citizenship on Puerto Rico through colonialism. So since 1898, so for about 120 years, 25 years, Puerto Ricans have been under US colonial control. And since 1917, so for about 100 years, all Puerto Ricans have been US citizens. And I can talk a little bit about what it means to be forced to be a US citizen. So Puerto Ricans didn't have an election and say, we would love to be US citizens, United States, come rescue us or come take care of us. No, the United States stipulated that we would be US citizens so that we could fight on behalf of the United States in World War I, in World War II, in the Vietnam War, in the Korean War, in the Iraq War, in every US war, Puerto Ricans have served in disproportionately high numbers. So Puerto Ricans become US citizens, and then we become disposable through the US military and disposable through a range of institutions. In other words, what I'm trying to explain is that through colonialism, populations and their practices are made more or less legitimate in particular times and places. And so I was trying to figure out how citizenship ends up becoming a lie of sorts. So my mother was not a citizen, but she was regarded as more American than my father. My father was born and raised US citizen. That was the only citizenship he ever had. And so I was trying to make sense of these issues in relation to stereotypes about, who different populations are, what the native population is in the United States, and the role of racial ideologies or racial stereotypes in leading people to think that if you are American, then this is what you look like. And these are the practices in which you engage. So all of this was happening in terms of trying to make sense of my own life and trying to understand the stereotypes that I was entering into or being confronted with. I mean, there was also my parents' citizenship status, but also their racial position. So my father was from, in Puerto Rico, a mixed race background, and we could talk about the kinds of racial stereotypes that you use to make sense of Puerto Rican racial categories in relation to Colombian racial categories, I'm sure. But my father in the United States was regarded as a Black man, so a mixed race Black man, and my mother was regarded as a white woman. And then my brother, my sister, and me were regarded as racially ambiguous in the United States. I know in Latin America, many people would look at me and say, why are you so obsessed with race? You're a white guy. or they would look at me and say, you know, you're part of the privileged class. And I understand that that's the case. In the United States, things are quite different in the sense that people look at me and they ask, what are you? Because I'm not presumed to be American. And so my family, people ask, where is your family from? Because they look at me and they think that they can imagine that I come from elsewhere. So I embody a kind of foreignness, even though the United States is where I was born and raised. So I was interested in how these stereotypes about race, both as an embodied phenomenon, but also as an imagined kind of phenomenon. So I don't think race just lives on the body. I think race lives in the imagination. It lives in the re-articulation of colonial histories. And so we use bodies, we use language, we use music, we use all kinds of stereotypes in order to make sense of these historical relationships that continue to be important today. And so that's where the entire ratiolinguistic project came from, trying to figure out how these borders around territories and nation states, these borders around languages and these borders around populations or demographics, how they are created together and how they've led us to a very dark world in many ways, a world where we police one another's movement, a world where we seek to accumulate in very specific ways. And those modes of accumulation allow very particular populations to be quite privileged and allow the masses, so the majority of the populations in various spaces, to be living in contexts of disposability in many ways. And so part of what I'm interested in through this project of ratiolinguistic ideologies is thinking about how all of these borders and these power structures are created in relation to one another, and how a different perspective on language and identity can open up a conceptual space for thinking otherwise, for thinking about a world, you know, that people have, a world beyond those borders that people have always been living in. So for example, what are alternative geographies we could imagine? There are spaces in the United States that are really Caribbean spaces, for example. So if we think about the relationship between New Orleans and Puerto Rico and Haiti and the Dominican Republic and Cuba and parts of Colombia and parts of Venezuela and parts of Central America and the kind of region that they constitute, it raises questions about relationships geographically, relationships demographically in terms of people, and relationships linguistically. Because it's not by chance that, for example, Puerto Rican Spanish is regarded as not real Spanish. Dominican Spanish is regarded as not real Spanish. Coastal Spanish in many of these spaces is regarded as not real or correct Spanish. So the closer to the coast, in many cases, it's proximity to Blackness, right? So the extent to which a given language practice is imagined in relation to Blackness, and by extension, the African diaspora, then those practices are often regarded as not the pure or the true or correct version of a given language. And so for Puerto Ricans in the United States, what that looks like is having people suggest that your Spanish is incorrect and your English is incorrect. And so essentially you use no language legitimately, or you're regarded as languageless. And so again, this is where these kinds of experiences and these sorts of stereotypes are where the framework of ratiolinguistic ideologies sort of, this is what it emerges out of. And let me just say one last thing, and then, you know, I'm happy to answer any questions. So the issue with L1, or, you know, a first language and a second language in the United States, you know, there's the idea, I think, that it's normal to be monolingual, that a normal human being speaks one language. Whereas in the rest of the world, multilingualism is regarded as a norm, and most people throughout the world are multilingual. And yet in the United States, we sort of imagine multilingualism as either a deficiency. So if you use the stigmatized varieties of multiple languages, then your multilingualism is framed as a handicap or as framed as a deficiency or a problem. Your multilingualism is, in some cases, it needs to be fixed. In other cases, we imagine for elite populations, so wealthy populations, multilingualism is an accomplishment, but it's not natural. In either case, it's either a disability or a problem, or it's an accomplishment, but it's not something that just happens in the world, which is what multilingualism is. It just happens. So all languages are intertwined. Multilingualism is a norm. And yet in the United States, we imagine multilingualism as this problem. And so this is why I have concerns about categories like L1 and L2. I think those categories emerge out of a European notion of language, which is one nation has one language, that is its L1. And then there are these people who move around, and these migrants, they bring us this L2 or L3 or whatever, and these migrants keep bringing all these problems to us. Now, I think an alternative perspective is to say, well, Europe, you colonized the entire world, and when you create these entanglements with the entire world, and your economy is entangled, and your entire political order is entangled, then migration is going to happen, and multilingualism, very specific forms of multilingualism are going to happen. And these questions about L1 and L2 end up hiding or obscuring that colonial history, and instead turning it into a language problem. So now we have all of these people who bring this L2 to us, rather than a colonial history that brought different kinds of populations and different kinds of states together. And so part of the ratio-linguistic perspective is trying to reject this notion that language learning is a problem, and instead think about the sorts of relationships that have always existed across linguistic borders, across political borders, and borders of identity. So that's the commitment of the work for me. Different scholars have different approaches, and I should say we debate this stuff. You know, we like to fight with each other about some of this, and I could say more about that too, but I'll turn it over to you all now.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is a lot to dissect, and I was just taking notes. And I really, I mean, at some point, I want to start with the discussion of migrant versus. Yeah, go ahead, Jonathan.
I have to say one more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
So because of these stereotypes that I've just shared with you, you have to imagine how strange it is right now for U.S. Latinos to see Latino, turn into this wonderful thing, this commodity associated with reggaeton. And when you hear on a song, when someone says Latino gang, like we're a gang, we're a club or a group or something like this, I'm thinking to my Latino gang. A gang is what we've been regarded as criminals in the United States, all of us in the United States. And so when elite Latin Americans use the term gang in relation to us, I'm thinking to myself, what are you you don't know what a gang is in relation to the kinds of our rates of imprisonment, our rates of, homelessness, all of these different challenges that we're facing in relation to criminalization. And then to see, so part of what we're dealing with questions around ratio-linguistic ideologies is how different populations are linked to one another and how they're not. And so these questions about Latinidad are very interesting in relation to that dialogue as well, because you see a globalization of Latinidad, but that's built on top of a colonial architecture. And the concern is, where does Europe live in Latin America? And how is it that very particular Europeans are being folded into Latinidad in ways that in the United States, we're talking about very specific Black and indigenous descent populations, not necessarily European descent populations. And so there's a very complex kind of dynamic there to figure out what we do with all of these ideas. So now I will be quiet.
No. We brought, you're a guest of honor, so definitely happy to. But I wanted to start kind of the conversation when you talked about the migrant versus immigrant. And I wanted to complicate it because there is a third term that you don't hear it much in the United States, but it's a third term that we hear here all the time. You may have heard this one, and it's expat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then there is this whole situation of migrant, immigrant, and now we have the conversation about expats. And then the question of who gets to call themselves and expat. Because there are, as you said, the difference between migrant and immigrant, there are some, again, some social and economic and racial, let's say, criteria. I mean, like I would say the case of us in Colombia, like we would never call Venezuelans expats. I mean, no, I don't think I never heard anybody saying the Venezuelan expats. You never hear saying Venezuelan expats. I mean, and if the students have ever heard the Venezuelan expats, no, you hear expats is like, oh, the U.S. So the people coming from the United States, oh, they're the expats. Or people coming from certain parts of Europe, they're the expats. But yeah, when you talk about people coming from Africa, we don't, yeah, or China, we don't talk about that. And so even in that distinction, though you said migrant and immigrant, as I said, there is the third term that, again, at least in Latin America, we hear it all the time, because I see groups on Facebook talking about expats in Medellin. I mean, and I know several have friends who migrated from different, and some of them call themselves expats. So I would say that would be the first kind of thing to complicate this, because even in their relationship, in the terms of migrant, immigrant, and expat, there is language involved in the equation. So even in the sense that we can say migrant, immigrant, and expat also tie in to the language you bring to the table.
Yeah, I mean, the expat, that category, I mean, colonialism is powerful. Let me say, you know, and these 500 years, you know, more than 500 years of the globalization of European colonialism are very powerful. And part of there's a philosopher in Martinique, Aimé Césaire, who was Frantz Fanon's teacher in Martinique. And Césaire says that colonization or colonialism is a world-making project. It transforms things. And so when you talk about a category like expat, I think of that as a form of world-making. It shows you how colonial power can allow people to kind of redefine categories, to redefine who they are in a given space and what rights they should have. And that's the expat category, the idea that you're a global elite. And a global elite is not an immigrant or a migrant. A global elite is elite. And so, you know, you should have access to all resources and all privileges. And, you know, I think part of what's really complex about this is that as someone who was born and raised in the United States, but in a, you know, made into a minority in the United States. So, you know, that's my experience here. But because I'm from the United States, are people having trouble hearing? Can you hear me okay, Raul?
Yeah, we can hear you fine. We can hear you fine.
Okay. So part of what's complicated is that while you might be a minority in the United States, because you are a US citizen, when I travel, I become an American, and I'm a privileged American now. And so I could become an expat if I were to leave the United States, which for me is, you know, I can't even imagine what that means. You know, my ability to move around in the world, I shouldn't say I can't imagine. Now I can't. I'm an adult now and I can imagine. But you have to understand from my experience growing up, I didn't leave the United States until I was almost 30 years old. I had never been outside. So the category of expat is for elite, wealthy people who can travel all over the world and have migration rights everywhere. Such that it's not even migration, it's just travel. Essentially, to be an expat is to be always in travel, in an elite privileged way. But that wasn't something that was even possible for me. I didn't have a passport until I was almost 30 years old to be able to leave the United States. So I think, you know, we have to be, it's very complicated to think about the ways that we're all in different ways, we're all uniquely privileged and marginalized depending on the context, and to think about how power positions us in relation to one another is something that I would want to think with you all about. So what are the unique kinds of privileges and forms of marginalization that exist in the context where you're working? and what does that mean for you and for the populations you're working with? And that's what the question about expats raises for me. And of course, the linguistic dynamic of that, where, you know, who has to learn, the fact that even right now we can do this call in English. Think about the kinds of, so I could talk about growing up in the United States and, you know, facing particular challenges in the United States, but then I can jump on a Zoom call with people in Colombia and have a conversation in English because of the power of the English language and the way that I become associated with that power because of having been born and raised in the United States. And so it's that complex relationship that I want us to think about. How is power positioning people in relation to one another? And how is it that we could simultaneously, all of us in different ways, be reproducing power and be subjects of power? So how is power acting on us, and how are we reproducing it? So with expats, I mean, that power is incredible. It has the capacity to redefine entire nations. So when you look throughout Latin America, you see a recolonization taking place along the coast of the entirety of Latin America, essentially, where lots of different private corporations are trying to, global private corporations are purchasing coastal lands to turn them into resorts and make them separate from the nation state. So in other words, it's no longer Colombia or Honduras or Guatemala or whatever. It's now just a private corporate space, a private corporate space for global consumption. So it's no longer a part of that nation state. And that ability to redefine borders, I think, can happen from a dominant way. And I'm interested in subaltern ways of redefining borders. That is, redefining borders from below. And that work is what's so important to me.
All right, so I have a lot of other ideas, but right now we have questions from the students, and I think that's far more important for the purpose of this. So we have questions here. We have like already a bunch of questions. So I have 4 questions. Let me just cover these 4 questions, and then we'll open the floodgates again. So there's one question saying my microphone doesn't work well right now, but I have a question, and it's a very personal question. It says, where do you think you belong to? Taking into account that you have a mixture of culture on your own.
Well, it's in some ways it's about what I belong to, but in other ways it's less what I think and more what other people think. So I'm interested in studying really carefully, you know, how it is that people identify themselves, but also crucially, what kinds of stereotypes are involved in shaping how other people, you know, classify you or see you, and what that means for your experiences in different institutional spaces. And so for me, I mean, when you talk about me having a mix, I have a mix of culture. Well, every human being has a mix of culture. So this idea that any human being is just one thing is simply not the case. And so the question of how it is that, give me 1 second, there's a little background noise, and so I want to just close a window so there's no more background noise. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, go for it, Jonathan, go for it. While Jonathan comes back, I'm going through, there are a lot of questions here, and there are very good questions. We'll be covering them. So go ahead, Jonathan.
So what I was trying to say is that in terms of having a mix of culture, every person has a mix of culture. Why is it that we only imagine certain people as being mixed? So why do we think some people are pure, or just some people are one thing and other people are mixed? That's one of the questions that's really important to me and really interesting to me. And in what context are what categories made, produced in what ways? So in other words, what are the demographic categories that exist in a given place? And in the United States, you know, we have, for example, historically what we call the one-drop rule. And what that meant was that anyone who has any African descent in the United States could be identified as Black in the United States context. And what the one-drop rule served to do was to maximize the nation's Black population, but that's within a history of enslavement. And so you have to think really carefully about why the United States strategically maximized a population that it could then enslave and then exploit in very particular ways. So that this racial logic around one drop is part of a logic of exploitation. And so we have to be really careful about just embracing a racial logic or rejecting a racial logic for that matter as well. We have to look really carefully at the histories through which these logics are created. So yeah, what am I? I mean, or, you know, who am I in relation to this is you know, I think we're all complex and positioned in different ways. But yeah, for me, you know, in the United States, what's complex is that people don't ask they only ask some of us, what are you, or where are you from? And so the question of which among us are imagined, which of our bodies are imagined as presenting an elsewhere, which of our bodies are imagined as coming to the United States from elsewhere? And I would ask you that in Colombia as well. Who is imagined as being from elsewhere, and why? And are they imagined as coming from an elite elsewhere, so from an elite position, or they are imagined as coming from a marginalized elsewhere? So yeah, that's one of the things that we could think about together.
I would just quickly add before I move to the next question that the question, where are you from? It's I mean, and that's a question that not me myself directly, but let's say my family circle is a question that I've had to listen to multiple times. In the case of my wife, so she gets asked that question a lot. Where are you from? And there comes a point that sometimes she says that just stop asking the question. I mean, she's like, I'm from here, and basically, yeah, she's from here. She's been here for a decade. She's from here, so it's a weird configuration. Now, there is another question. This question from Sebastian.
Sorry,
he says, "Yeah, Emmanuel, what's going on?"
No, like I wanted to say something. Like, it's really weird how we like tend to accept people from other places that easily. Like, for example, if you have a friend from another country, but they come here and you're like, yeah, you're one of us, you're from here. But from in other countries, that's not the case. They're like, you're an outsider. So it's really weird. I don't know. It was just a thought.
Yeah. No, it's a good thought.
But this is exactly what I was trying to talk about earlier when I was referencing my mother and my father. So in terms of my research, to take it away from my personal experience, in my research, and you know, so in different cities in the United States, what I've looked at is the way that, for example, in Chicago, a lot of my work has been in the city of Chicago. You have people who migrate to Chicago from Poland, and they might have arrived in Chicago yesterday or last week or last month, and they are seen as American. They're seen as, you know, they're imagined as coming from Chicago right away. But you have someone who comes from Mexico or Guatemala or Puerto Rico, and they're imagined as, and they might have been, their family might have come to Chicago 50 years ago, or in some cases 100 years ago. And so they were born in Chicago, they've only ever lived in the United States, and yet they're still understood as being foreign. And so that's part of what's important to me, how these racial, you can see the colonial kind of structure that's involved in these racial kinds of perceptions, because you have the notion that a very specific kind of whiteness in the United States, and remember, whiteness is simultaneously about physical stereotypes like skin color and hair texture and all kinds of things, but whiteness is about political belonging as well, and what we would imagine as an ideal citizen. And so that's what you have to figure out in each nation state. Who embodies the imagined ideal citizen subject and why? Who is it that is the face of each nation state, or who can be unproblematically the face of each nation state? And that's why you have to pay attention to elections. You have to pay attention to beauty pageants. You have to pay attention to popular culture and music in order to see who is the face of the nation in any given moment, and whose face needs to be explained and whose face is just seen as natural. And when I say face, that's just one piece of what a presentation of self is. And so that's a face is one part of a broader story. So yeah, the question of who we accept and who we don't is interesting to me. But also getting back to that previous question, who do we think of as mixed and who as pure? And there's also, in the United States, people imagine a mixed race future, a future where everyone will be mixed and everyone will be brown in some ways. And then that's imagined as being a positive future. And then, so you see a lot of magazines in the United States or movies that imagine Brazil as the racial future. And so eventually as the story goes, we will all look like Brazil. Well, how's inequality going in Brazil? How's race working out in Brazil right now? And when you look at the experiences of Black and African descent populations in Brazil, when you look at the experiences of indigenous populations in Brazil, you see very quickly, there are serious questions about why we imagine that being, that certain nations they embody progress or the future in a particular way. And so these ideas are deeply troublesome. And I know this is relevant in the Colombian context as well, just in my very brief visits to places like Cartagena and elsewhere, where, the idea, the image of Colombia that's circulated globally is not what Colombia looks like in lots of spaces in terms of who embodies the nation. So the idea, it's wild that the entire world keeps discovering Blackness in Latin America, even though when we look at the history of slavery, and when we look at the history of the Middle Passage from Africa to Latin America and the United States, the vast majority of people went to Brazil and Venezuela and Colombia and the Caribbean, and yet we still keep discovering Blackness in Latin America. And I want to think about why we keep discovering Blackness in Latin America when Blackness has always been in Latin America for, hundreds of years at this point. And that's part of that racial project that positions Latin America as a mixed race space. But we want to think about the violence of that kind of a stereotype.
All right, so there's another question here. And then Sebastian is asking, could you talk more about racial linguistics? What that exactly means? He says, thanks.
Sure. So for me, the reason I wrote the book, Looking Like a Language, Sounding Like a Race, and the reason I was really interested in this idea of a racial-linguistic ideologies or a racial-linguistic perspective is because I felt as though so much of our discussions about language, they sound like L1 and L2, and they sort of take everything at face value. So as though we were living in a very practical world, a very orderly, straightforward world. People have identities and people have languages, and those identities and languages just exist, naturally. And, we just need to figure out how to get along better, how to learn more language, how to, define who we are in relation to one another. And my sense was that we had accepted those categories at face value. Because what I knew in the United States, for example, is that you could be classified as an English language learner, you could be classified as someone who doesn't know English, even though English is the only language you use all day long. So if you are a person of color in the United States, it's either you don't know English at all, you're imagined as not knowing English at all, or you're imagined as using the wrong variety of English. And in some cases, that variety is framed as subhuman or not even language. And so this is part of what I wanted to understand with the concept like a racial-linguistic ideologies, to sort of say, wait a second, this is not just about the language practices that people are producing, or this isn't just about the identities that people are. This is about the creation of those identities and the creation of these categories and the ways that they're used to manage people and to impose boundaries on top of people and to provide access to rights and resources and opportunities, or to deny that access. And so that's been, that's where a racial-linguistic perspective came from for me, to kind of figure out, wait, how is it that we keep talking about, when I enter schools in the United States, and many of the school leaders who I work with, they say, yeah, we need to help these kids learn English. But then you walk around the school and all the kids are speaking English and everyone's speaking English. And yet English is framed as a problem in the United States. English is not, if you live in the United States, and if you grow up in the United States for any, period of time, you're going to learn English. That's, if you're here for a period of time, I should say, and it depends on the age here. There are lots of issues involved, but I guess the point is to say that we need to understand how our imagination of the United States and how our imagination of language has shaped people's experiences profoundly. And so that's what this sociolinguistic perspective is about.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes into, and I was making some note when you talked about the languagelessness, that there is an issue that is linked to that, and it's the whole notion of accent, and how that plays out. The whole sentence of the infamous quote, "You speak with an accent," which has become a symbol of not sounding like, or being kind of othered. It's always like the whole question of, you speak with an accent, and I always like to question where you don't. I mean, like, are there people who speak without an accent in real life? Like, it's like you go across the United States and you can see such variation of accents, and then when you come from another part of the world, they're like, yeah, I kind of hear an accent. I'm like, well, even in that sense, that the notion of, oh, you speak English with an accent, goes into that thing you were saying, that people can say, no, we have to work, you have to help improve their English, or even the construction of ELL as something that you cannot get out of. Because I think that's interesting. When I did when I was in grad school, I had to do an analysis of the bilingual education system, and one of the things I found that was interesting is the ESL track does not have an AP. You don't have advanced placement ESL. You just go to language arts. So it's kind of like, so there is this whole notion that ELL is something you can never get out of, and you're always in need of like remedial work, so to speak.
Can I share my screen to kind of give an example of something
please.
that might be helpful?
Go for it.
Do that.
I think you should be able to.
I think you would have to make me
hold on.
host or something.
Oh no,
Yeah.
let me just take care of that right now. Let me just take care of that right this minute. Yeah, I think you should be able to now.
Okay. Oh yeah, it says I'm co-host. All right.
Yeah, you're co-hosting, so go for it.
Okay. Can you see that?
Yeah.
I'll make it bigger right now. Sorry.
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Okay, so what I want to show you is something like this. So I saw in the question, why do we need ratiolinguistics? What is this? What are we doing with this? So part of what I want you to understand is, how these stereotypes work in different spaces. So this is a list of examples that are used to track the language practices of Black students in the United States, of African American or Black students in the United States. And so you have a list of English examples, and then there's you see what's underlined is the specific feature that is being focused on in each example. So this is standard English. So this is the stereotype this is correct English. These are possible African American responses. So in other words, these are Black English responses. And then this column is what's wrong with the Black responses to fix them so that they could be made into English responses.
I'm sorry, can you make it bigger because I can't read?
Sorry, I'll do that again right now. Give me 1 second. And
there you go.
Can you see it here? Okay. So let me just show you one example. If you look at example 17, it says, she uses a pen to write. So an African-American child might allegedly pronounce that as pin instead of pen. And so we want to figure out why this is saying this is wrong, when that's just a different pronunciation pattern. In other words, pin versus pen is the same. It's a very common kind of practice, but it's framed as a problem here. So you would have to imagine in Spanish, You know, when I think about how Puerto Ricans pronounce things as compared to Mexicans in the United States, we have lots of different pronunciation patterns. You would have to imagine a situation where all of the Mexican patterns are here and all of the Puerto Rican patterns are here. And all of the Puerto Rican patterns are framed as problems, and they need to be fixed to make them like the Mexican patterns. And so that's what I'm trying to think about, how it is that we end up doing this. And this is the Mexican screener that's used in the United States. No, there's no screener like this for white children in the United States. It's just for African-American kids and Mexican kids and Asian kids. And so the Mexican-American screener, look at number 16, THE apple, the apple. So a Mexican-American child might pronounce that as the apple. And it says you're supposed to pronounce THE as the before a word that starts with a vowel. So because apple starts with an A, you're supposed to say the apple instead of the apple. I have no idea where this rule comes from. This is not a rule that I know as someone who was born and raised in the United States. And yet it's a rule that's used to stigmatize Mexican-American children in the United States. So this is why we need a ratio-linguistic perspective. We need to understand how conclusions are drawn in advance, or assumptions of deficiency or inferiority exist in advance, and how those assumptions, you know, we need to understand how those assumptions are shaping people's experiences. So I wanted you to understand the context I'm working in. And I want you to think about what that looks like in Colombia. So whose language practices would be here on the left column in Colombia, and whose language practices would be here? And I want to know how many different versions of this you could have in Colombia, for which populations practices would be targeted in the Colombian context. That's what I want to think about that question everywhere in the world. So essentially, anywhere colonialism has happened, I want to think about these questions, which is everywhere in the world.
But I have a question about that, like about pronunciation. So there, like it has to exist like a core pronunciation, but after I read that, I felt kind of confused, like all of your papers, because of course we do have like a one phonetic class, and we learned that, and even though the teacher was a linguist, you say like that, right? He made these jokes about what you said, like about how some Colombians from other parts of not Medellin, they have this fun accent and how ridiculous they sound in English, and that we needed to sound like more native because that shows like more respect to say it like that. Like he felt very proud about his perfect like native English, but it makes me wonder like we need to achieve that. Like if that's the correct pronunciation, or there's a correct pronunciation, or there's not.
So let me show you. Let me show you one more thing. Or I don't know whether to show you right now. I guess the other example, or some of the other examples to show you would be to demonstrate how even when kids, even when we talk about correct pronunciation, this is part of the challenge that I wanted to be able to respond to, is to say, wait a second, but even when some of our kids, and not just kids, people in general, are using the correct pronunciation, they're still imagined as being wrong or incorrect, or they're still perceived as foreign, or there's still something that's not right about them. And so this is what I'm really interested in, how even with our assumptions about correctness, that when certain people learn the language and they try to fix their accent in a particular way, they're never regarded as acceptable. And yet other people, like our president of the United States right now, Donald Trump, and previous presidents like George W. Bush, these are people who produced English patterns that for many of us are wrong. Based on these stereotypes that you learn in school, these rules you learn in school, so much of what they do with language is wrong, is incorrect. And yet they're regarded as American, and they're regarded as presidential, as people who could be on the highest stage or be in the highest positions of power. And so this is what I'm interested in, how it is that we have different standards for different populations. And for some populations, these stereotypes are life-changing negatively. And for other populations, you can have access to any opportunities regardless of what you're doing with language. And so this is what I think we often tell people, if you would just learn the correct variety of Spanish, or if you would just learn the correct variety of English, then you could become a citizen, then you could have access to job opportunities, then you could, have access to all sorts of resources. But that's just not the case for millions of people who have learned, have participated in the process of learning and yet are still not accessing opportunities. So, and it's not to say, I understand that if you're a language teacher in a school, then it's your job to help people to understand the pronunciation patterns and the stereotypes and the rules of a language, or rules that are associated with a given language. But part of what I would want to suggest is that those patterns are much broader than we've ever known. And so the question is, to me, which range of patterns are we willing to accommodate and which are we not willing to accommodate? And why will we make exceptions for Donald Trump and for George W. Bush, but the most privileged people get all of the exceptions and the marginalized people don't get any exceptions? So why is it that the people who already have so much privilege, we give them even more privilege to do whatever they want with language, and the people who are most marginalized, we stigmatize them the most? So our rules are the most restrictive and the harshest towards the most marginalized. And I find that to be a very sad situation and a very damaging situation that we need to move beyond. So if you're a language teacher, I get that you have to teach patterns. I understand. But the question is, how is it that you could demonstrate for students that there's a broad range of pronunciation patterns? So when we say, this is correct English, throughout the United States, even in the United States alone, let alone other parts of the world, what counts? I think there's background. There we go. So, what counts as correct English in different parts of the United States and different parts of the world is completely different. What British English is and Australian English and New Zealand English and American English or US English, what they are so different from each other. Why are we willing to accept all of that difference within privileged sectors of the English language so that I can't even understand a British person in certain situations? Even though English is a language that I've used throughout my entire life, I can't understand Australians and New Zealanders in some situations, but that doesn't position Australians and New Zealanders as semi-lingual. That positions them as other legitimate people. And why is it that we afford that legitimacy to some people and not others? And that's what I'm interested in studying.
Actually, now that you brought up, and the background noise, just to give you context, is because of the pandemic, since we're all home, sometime during the day we have the street vendors. So I think at this point, somebody may be selling aguacates or something like that. Sometimes aguacates, but just that's the background noise, just to give you a...
Happens every single day.
It happens to all of us. So welcome to, I was going to say in that sense, welcome to Colombia, because that's our life in the pandemic. Welcome to virtual education in Colombia, my dear good friend, Dr. Rosa. Now, I have a couple of questions, and since you brought up you actually mentioned the word semi-lingual, there have some questions from the students, and I want to try to clump them into one cluster. So they are asking questions about the concept of bilingualism. And I'm going to read Jesse's question, and then Jesse's question is also going to cover Eliana's question, so we'll get into that. So I would like to ask about the concept of bilingualism. It's clear that a person is bilingual when they have the ability to manage a second language, but when a person is immersed in a culture and has a limited use of the language, is it still bilingual? I'm a little confused about when a person is bilingual or semi-lingual. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that, Jonathan.
Yeah, and I see Camilo's question too about the kind of Spanish that I spoke growing up, and because I think these questions are related to one another. And I see Eliana also asked about the difference between bilingual and semi-lingual. So hopefully I can answer all of those questions together. So for me, this question about first of all, okay. My orientation to language is that all languages are infinitely overlapping with one another. So languages are connected to each other. So even the project of separating languages in the first place is an interesting project. And I want to think about how that happens. For example, the English language historically comes from many different spaces, but English is structurally a Germanic language. And yet we don't necessarily think of the English language as German or as being a Germanic language. Why is it that that history has been erased from the English language? And I think by studying these historical erasures, we can figure out, oh, okay, how is it that there are more interconnections than we've ever understood before? Why are the varieties of Spanish that are spoken in different parts of Latin America so different from one another? Why is it, that colonizers who came from Andalusia in Spain are different from colonizers who came from other regions? And how is it that, people who came to Puerto Rico and to the coastal regions of Caribbean Latin America came from very specific regions in Spain? And that language, Spanish, is not even a language. First of all, we're talking about Castile. We're talking about a very particular kingdom within Spain, the Castile, such that Castellano is elevated to the status of the Spanish language. But to be very clear, in Galicia and different regions in Spain, there are entire languages that could have been Spanish. And what happens to be elevated to the status of Spanish is a situation that has to do with a very specific set of historical processes. But we just treat Spanish like it's a thing, when in fact it's Castilian. It's a very specific region, a very specific kingdom that is elevated to define all of what Spain is. But that's ridiculous in so many ways. And so we have to understand historically how those how these separations took place, because it's histories of violence that produced those separations, and by reproducing them we reenact those histories of violence. And so that's part of what I'm interested in. And I think that the category of bilingual and semilingual, or the distinction between someone as bilingual or semilingual, is precisely an enactment of that history of violence, which is to say, who is it that is associated with two legitimate kingdoms? And I'm using the term kingdom metaphorically. So who is it that's understood as using two languages that are associated with two power holders legitimately, and that makes you bilingual? And so English and Spanish can make someone bilingual. But many of my colleagues who speak indigenous languages from Latin America in the United States, for example, lots of languages on the border of Mexico and Guatemala, or indigenous languages throughout Latin America, often they're said to speak dialects. So the languages that they speak aren't even regarded as languages, as indigenous languages. But the relationship between different indigenous languages in Latin America, a close colleague of mine who worked with a language called Chatino, a language family called Chatino that's on the border of Guatemala and Mexico. The varieties of Chatino that she spoke were as different from one another structurally as all of the Romance languages, as Spanish, French, Portuguese, Romanian, Italian, right? So that the varieties of Chatino, of an indigenous language on the Mexican-Guatemalan border, were as different. So she spoke about 6 or 7 varieties of Chatino. So in other words, she spoke about 7 languages just within that language family, and then English on top of that. But she was never regarded, those 7 languages she spoke were not regarded as separate languages. They were just regarded as indigenous dialects. And so she wasn't even regarded as bilingual. She was an indigenous woman. She wasn't bilingual. She was seen as an indigenous migrant. And so this is why I want to think really critically around these classifications. And who is it that we think is bilingual and who we think is semilingual? So in other words, to answer Jessica's question, I wouldn't say that anybody is semilingual. To be semilingual is to be framed as not having language. And so I think that semilingualism is a racist kind of rendering of language, or it emerges out of a set of racist histories. Now, we could ask the really serious question though. If you're a teacher or if you're a student and you're learning multiple languages, you probably want to know, when am I bilingual? So when do I cross a threshold beyond which I become bilingual? And I can say, I'm bilingual, I use languages. And so I think that I understand that if you're a teacher or a student, you want to have an answer to that question. I'm afraid though that whoever, whatever authority you draw on to to authorize yourself or to position yourself as legitimately bilingual, you have to think really critically about that authority and who's in, because the question of who's in and who's out will always be used to harm somebody. And so you got to think about what that harm, what kind of harm is being done. I think bilingualism is much more widespread than we understand. And that's so I'm less in arguing that particular people are or aren't bilingual, when in fact, I don't even think we've even begun to understand how widespread multilingualism and bilingualism are. So I would encourage us to broaden our perspective on what bilingualism could be. And I think it's much broader. And this gets to my experience growing up, where I became a receptive bilingual, which is to say Spanish was used in my household, but usually one way, where Spanish was used with particular family members. And I would grow up hearing Spanish. And so I had receptive skills, but I didn't speak much Spanish. So we would have two-way conversations, what we call as asymmetrical bilingual conversations, where they would speak Spanish to me and I would speak English back to them. Now, what's really interesting about receptive bilingualism as a very interesting and powerful form of bilingualism is that you might think that you don't know a language, even if you have receptive skills, when in fact, all it takes is a few weeks then, or some time, not just a few weeks, but it takes some time to be in an environment where that language is a primary language that's being used in some context, and then your receptive skills become productive skills relatively quickly. And I would want to think with you all about different domains of language production, whether it's a domain of listening, of writing, of reading, of different forms of comprehension and different literacy practices. I think that there are many bilingualisms. So rather than asking when someone is bilingual or when they're semilingual, I'm much more interested in expanding the range of bilingualisms that we even pay attention to, because I think bilingualisms and multilingualisms are everywhere. And by broadening our perspective on them, we kind of broaden our sense of what kind of world we're living in and what kinds of connections we have with one another and responsibilities we have to one another's well-being. So that's my investment in recognizing those connections in new ways.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
First of all, nice to meet you. My question is, do you think we lost or we lose the use of our native language when we are learning a second one? Because we are always trying to use one more than the other one. So when we're learning a second language, we can lose maybe vocabulary or some cultural things about our native language. And I think it also impacts culturally. What do you think about?
I mean, thank you for your question, Laura. For me, the issue is I guess I would want to say it depends on the context and the languages involved. So first of all, part of what I'm interested in is, in any given context, what are the long-standing languages that are in use in that space, and which of those languages are framed as foreign or native, and why? So that's one question. Because I think that if you have a situation where there are languages that have been in use in a given space for a very long time and yet are still not recognized, and that's the example of Spanish in the United States. Remember, so there were indigenous languages in the United States prior to both Spanish and English, but then Spanish was brought to the United States before English, and yet Spanish is regarded as a foreign language in the United States. So you have this really interesting situation. I'm in California, and so all of the place names in California are Spanish. So Los Angeles, San Francisco, all of the Vallejo, which you call Vallejo. So you call San Francisco, San Francisco. Los Angeles is Los Angeles. And so there are various people in the United States who don't even recognize that Spanish was here before English. And so that's part of that history of that kind of erasure is something that's powerful in terms of the way that we organize language learning in different spaces. And so the question of, in a context like California, or the United States, where Spanish is everywhere throughout the United States, the idea that in a classroom to learn Spanish or English, you should keep the Spanish and English languages separate from one another, it just doesn't make any sense, because Spanish and English live together throughout the United States. Now, in other contexts where you might have a more recent migrant population, whether it's an indigenous population from somewhere in the Americas, or whether it's more recent migrants from different parts of Africa or different parts of Asia that don't have the same historical relationship, okay, then what education looks like might be very different from a population where they've been in this place for more than a century or 100 years or something like this. But part of what I'm interested in is why we imagine that languages need to be kept separate from one another in order to learn them, especially when there are so many environments throughout the world where we're using these languages together. Now, it's not to say that in certain circumstances, it might not be strategically productive in very specific circumstances to say, okay, we want to privilege the use of this language in this context, or this set of patterns in this context, because we really want to have a chance to practice them. I think that's fine. I don't have any problem with that whatsoever, as long as we understand that we're creating an artificial scenario that is not how language is used in the world, which is we say, oh, okay, in a conversation, we're only going to use this set of patterns right now, as though we could always consciously control our language use. And so I think it's just really important in our educational spaces to make sure that we're that we're clear on the ways that language is used throughout the world, and the ways that we are creating an environment that is supposed to support language use in the world. And instead, often our focus on very specific patterns in classrooms can end up being harmful to students or unproductive for students. So the question is, what strategies for learning patterns are effective and what strategies are harmful? And in the United States, what we find often is that very particular linguistic patterns are framed as the rules, as the patterns that you use, that you need to master in order to use the Spanish language. And so for Spanish speakers in the United States, or people like myself who are positioned as heritage speakers, who might have grown up hearing Spanish but not speaking as much Spanish, our use of subjunctive or imperfect subjunctive, so very specific verbs and verb conjugations, are used to position us as legitimate or illegitimate users of the Spanish language. And so you have many people who are teaching Spanish in the United States who are not from Latin America, not from Spain, but who memorized all the rules, who are essentially white Americans who memorized all of the rules, but who can't have a conversation in Spanish. So they know how to conjugate all of the verbs, but they can't have a conversation. And they're regarded as a more correct user of the Spanish language than someone who uses the Spanish language all day long in conversations with families and friends, but who doesn't know that one rule or that one verb. And the question is, why have we constructed language in a way so that learning the rules means you're a legitimate, learning certain rules positions you as a legitimate user of that language, regardless of whether you can even use it to have a conversation. And so it's this separation of languages, or what my colleague at Stanford, my mentor at Stanford, Guadalupe Valdez, calls the curricularization of language. How language is made into a subject, an academic discipline that we need to be very careful about, and we need to think really critically about. So Laura, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's somehow I think about this.
That was more than what I was expecting for. Thanks for it.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, that's a very, and I think even those questions about when and what and how we get to use language, I think it's important because the problem, and we've talked about it in the class, that one of the problems we have is this ideal that we think of bilingualism as this balance, or that you're perfectly capable of using two languages for everything. When the reality is that language use is more fluid than, oh, we all have to be super fluent. I mean, I think that, and I think that's the understanding of bilingualism that we have sometimes in education, that you have to be super fluent in the two languages you use. And I think that's harmful because then that is leaving, as you pointed out, Jonathan, that's leaving out a lot of people out of the equation.
Well, so that's why I'm much more interested in trying to develop new ways of perceiving language, new ways of actually recognizing bilingualisms everywhere, and multilingualisms, plural, everywhere. So rather than just have this single category of bilingual or the single category of multilingual, and then we end up thinking that, okay, there's a moment when you become this new person, this new bilingual person, and before then you were just this monolingual person. That moment never happens in any straightforward way. And in fact, language learning is happening across the lifespan. So why not be open to lots of bilingualisms, lots of multilingualisms everywhere? And so if anything, I think that's what we need to focus on, not figuring out when someone really becomes bilingual. What we need to focus on is how bilingualisms are everywhere in ways that we haven't recognized previously. And we need to see those as opportunities for communication, for connection and interaction that we might not have previously recognized.
I do have one question because it has to do, again, with the context of the course. So throughout this 7 weeks, and I can't believe it, we're almost done with this course, it's kind of sad. We have gone through a gamut of concepts. So we talked about bilingualism itself. We talked about biliteracy. We talked about translanguaging, and we mentioned the idea of polylanguaging, and we talked about a little bit about code switching. So my question is, it's a very technical question, is how do you see the idea of racial linguistics in relation to the other concepts that we know are circulating? Do you see them as complementary, as antagonistic relationships? How, I mean, in the sense of, in your position as a racial linguistic scholar, the person who coined the term, how do you see the other terms playing out?
I mean, it's funny for me because I didn't, okay, I should type in the chat something so you can see the difference. So the article that I first wrote was focused on that, racial linguistic ideologies and a racial linguistic perspective, right?
Yeah, the 2016 article, yes.
Yeah, the book, that book, Racial Linguistics, with an S, that became a whole other thing. So note that racial linguistic ideologies and racial. So you said you were going to be technical, so I need to be technical.
Yeah, please. I mean, absolutely.
So racial linguistic ideologies and a racial linguistic perspective, you see racial linguistic is an adjective there. So it's describing something else. Racial linguistics is made into a noun. So that book, that I did not publish that book. There was a book called Racial Linguistics that was published by someone else. Yeah. And that book is what made this into something else altogether.
Yeah.
I'm scared of nouns. I'm really afraid of nouns. When you nouns are, once you make something into a thing, I worry about it. And so I really liked using racial linguistic as an adjective. I like adjectives because they're ways of perceiving things, but I'm not claiming that it's a thing. But once you make something into a thing, I worry about how it will end up reproducing the very systems that you're trying to disrupt. And so that's why I didn't want to make racial linguistics into a thing. Other people love to make racial linguistics into a thing because it gives them, so we have sociolinguistics. And I think right now in the world, many people are discovering race and they want to talk about race and racism. And racial linguistics feels like a tool for doing that. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad that people want to talk about race, but I'm worried about the ways that their interest in race as something that is based on stereotypes. That's my concern. And so my concern is that racial linguistics ends up being a tool for reproducing those stereotypes. So that's part of the struggle. So I've had to go back and forth with people around so in my writing, I do not use the noun. And I've never used the noun in my writing. So you might say, who even knows the difference? Nobody. Nobody knows the difference, but I do. And it's important to me for my work, just to try to figure out what to do with this. Now, that's not to say I might not use the noun at some point. At this point, people really like that noun, though. They like to say racial linguistics.
And and it's the book. I mean, because I've read the book. It's the book that Sami Alim co-edited. That's the one that you're talking about. Yeah.
Yes, but here's the problem with that book. That book came out after Nelson Flores and I wrote the Ratiolinguistic Ideologies article. That book was supposed to have a different title. The book was not supposed to be titled Ratiolinguistics. So I have a chapter in that book. And the book had a different title before. And then we published our article, and then the editor of that book retitled the book Ratiolinguistics. And I said, oh no, this is not what I wanted to do with this, but I can't control other people. So now you all are dealing with how scholars fight with each other. So here we are. This is a scholarly argument. So how is this related to other concepts? Let me get to the more important part of the question, though. I would like to hope that any of these discussions about race are troubling, are upsetting and disrupting some of the normative concepts. So within linguistics, for example, questions about sociolinguistics are often on the margins, or sociolinguistics is very marginalized within linguistics, which is to say, in linguistics we privilege studying structures, and then sociolinguistics is understood as studying society. So that's not the primary focus of the discipline of linguistics. However, from a ratiolinguistic perspective, society needs to be front and center in our approach to studying language structures. And so, that's why for me, a ratiolinguistic perspective is a way of saying, wait, there are different questions we could be asking. There are different methods we could be using. There are different political commitments that we could have to the communities we're working with and to the broader societies that we're a part of. And so, I would like to hope that the concept of ratiolinguistic ideologies or a ratiolinguistic perspective, or even ratiolinguistics, I would like to hope that any of these concepts is helping to push us in some different directions to ask questions about, whose experiences have we located at the center of this discussion on language, and who have we positioned at the margins, and how can we flip that? How can we disrupt that to think about experiences that we've previously ignored, and to think about possibilities that we haven't been open to?
And I think I like the idea. I mean, when I brought the question about how these terms connect, is because sometimes, and you've seen this in our work in linguistics, in my work in literacy, that sometimes we tend to create these borders across concepts that don't exist. I always remember, and I remember one on an ARA conference, we had Bill Cope, and they asked him a question. There's like, so what is the difference between multiliteracies in the work you do and Brian Street's new literacy studies? And he's like, well, basically there's none. And you could see the face in the audience, like, what? But they were flabbergasted by the answer, like, no, there's really not much of a difference. I mean, like, and the difference sometimes are so minutiae, not necessarily the big issues, but sometimes, and I want to bring that up, especially in the case of these young teachers we have in the crowd, because sometimes we have these distinctions and we start creating camps that don't necessarily exist, or that we even ourselves don't necessarily ascribe to, but we kind of sell it, that translanguaging and racial linguistic ideology are totally different. No, they're not that different once you look deep into that. And I think it's important for the young teachers to recognize that you can talk about issues related to race and if from a translanguaging perspective, just as well as you could do it from a racial linguistic ideology perspective.
Yeah, I think a lot of these debates among scholars, they're not that interesting to me. I mean, I just think there's what's happening in the world is way too important, and the communities that I work with are, the issues that they're facing are way too significant to get in a fight with my colleagues about whether ratiolinguistics is a noun or an adjective. I just don't care. I mean, there's too much going on. People are trying to figure out how to live, whether they have a house and food and a school to go to and an environment that's not on fire. So I'm not going to fight about adjectives and nouns in that kind of a context. And I think just as I'm suggesting that there are bilingualisms and multilingual. Let's just say there are lingualisms. There's languaging that we haven't understood. I think that, and that leads me to look for new connections and new possibilities. I'm interested in how these frameworks are connected to each other, and how we could, by integrating them in different ways, we could open up some different possibilities. So, for example, the colleague of mine who coined the term racio-linguistic ideologies with me, Nelson Flores, his teacher was Ofelia Garcia, and she's the person who created the translanguaging framework.
Yeah.
And so translanguaging is the grandparent or the parent of racio-linguistic ideologies. So, and my teachers, they worked on language ideologies. So all of the people who have written various kinds of things about language ideologies, that's also the parent of racio-linguistic ideologies. So language ideologies and translanguaging create racio-linguistic ideologies. And so these frameworks are connected to each other.
And I think I think that's very important, because sometimes it's important, and that would be kind of like one of the big reflections for the students is always take your time to trace back the origins of the terms, because once you start tracing back, you realize, as you pointed out, Nelson Flores and I came together and we did this, and then when you look at kind of our family trees, so to speak, the family trees have implications, and then you realize, oh, these things are interconnected. It's just that sometimes the way we explain it to students, the way we even advertise, quote unquote, the terms, overlooks those histories. And then we create these binary oppositions across the terms that are not even artificial, they're non-existent.
Yeah. Well, that's my point. They're not, when you say they're not even artificial, they're non-existent. I mean, that's the interesting thing to me, how so many of the boundaries that we've created, we have to do a lot of work to impose boundaries on ideas and on experiences that shouldn't be separate from one another, shouldn't be understood as separate from one another in the first place. So yeah, that's why my goal is not to sort of tell you what racio-linguistics is or what it isn't. My goal is to open up a set of questions and to say, how are you thinking really critically about how colonialism and capitalism have intertwined to produce your world and the possibilities within it? And, and how is language learning wrapped up in those histories and legacies of colonialism and capitalism? That's what I want to think about. I see another question about translanguaging and what Catalina, what's that question?
No, it's just that when you said that these two concepts created racio-linguistic, my internet, I don't know what happened, and I couldn't hear.
It was translanguaging and racial-linguistic ideology.
No.
But
languaging created, language and other concepts created racio-linguistic.
Yeah. Yeah, I got it. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
there you go. Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, there you go.
I do have a question.
And I should say, in terms of language ideologies, which was my training, my favorite thing about that training is that language ideologies will ruin your world. Once you read this literature, you have to understand. When I was a student, we weren't allowed to use the term language. We couldn't even use the word language, because to use the word language was to already enter into the colonial ideology that imagines that certain practices are language and other practices are not language, are just dialects or something else that's outside of language. So we had to kind of rework what language is altogether as a thing in the world. And so once you're thinking from that perspective, none of these categories work for you. Language, dialect, bilingualism, monolingualism, L1, L2, nothing makes sense anymore. And that's the world that I live in, where all of these categories don't make any sense whatsoever. And so I'm trying to dig my way out of that world. That's I think, and I'm going to be doing that for the rest of my life, digging out of that space.
Yeah, but I think when you bring out the language ideology thing, I think it's important for, again, in a class that we call bilingualism, it's not to take the terms at face value and question them. As you said, I mean, I think kind of like in the way when you answer the question and kind of like the question we had, what's the role of the L1 and the L2? When you started saying, listen, it's not as simple as L1 and L2, that's more complicated. I think for me, that was the end game. Not necessarily to answer give a concrete answer to the question, but to start problematizing even what we mean by L1 and L2, because even that changes. Even when you say L1 as it can be mother language or can be first language, and then the definition of first language is very different from mother language. That's like, that starts unraveling all these implications that for academic purposes, your L1 doesn't have to be the one you were born speaking. I mean, and that complicates things even further. So I think that was the idea. The idea of having this conversation was, let's not, because sometimes we either trivialize the terms too much. And I see that happens with bilingualism. And even in the case of Colombia, we talk about bilingual policy, but the bilingual policy in, Valentina was asking that question, that our bilingual policy is English and Spanish. But in the bilingual policy, the indigenous languages of the country, the 65 indigenous languages, the 2 Afro-Colombian language, the Romani language, and the sign language, and Colombian sign language are not part of that equation. We have some policy for their protection, but that policy does not necessarily involve putting them in the curriculum. Like, well, no, we have this emphasis on English, and we call that a bilingual plan. So even in that sense, this is the whole idea is, let's start complicating these terms. That when people say, like, oh, this is a bilingual school, like, is it really a bilingual school? And I know, like, Nelson sometimes goes on Twitter and he's constantly raising questions about that. Like, if you go to his Twitter account, he raises a lot of questions about what it means to call a bilingual program or a bilingual school or dual language. And he raises a lot of those questions on Twitter. So that, I think for me, that's the goal, is lead them into complicating those terms.
Yep.
And raising those questions that, yeah, you're gonna have to spend the rest of your life unraveling, but I think that's the whole point, is not to take them for granted, not to take them as monolithic, because even when you talked about Latinidad, like, Latinidad is becoming a monolith, like no, I mean, Latinidad is a very, very murky, that's very murky waters, because Latinidad in Colombia is not, I mean, even in Colombia, even saying calling myself Colombiana, like, what does that even mean, to call myself Colombiano when it's this country is so diverse from north to south, from east to west? Like, even in the region I live in, the coffee region, I mean, if you're calling yourself Paisa, it's like, okay, Paisa has so many connotations. Once you go south, you start going south, it's like, that changes entirely. I go to Pereira, yeah, we sound similar, but it's like, yeah, we're not the same, and we can recognize the differences. So, and I think it's that. But go ahead.
So that what you just explained in terms of regions in Colombia and what it means to be a paisa, what that term refers to, depending, and how that shifts depending on where you are, that very process or that very set of ideas, that's a symbolic process of creating boundaries, and those boundaries can be remapped across on smaller scales or on wider scales. So within Colombia, you can draw distinctions, infinite distinctions between regions and towns and households and neighborhoods and communities, and it can be on the smallest scale or on the biggest scale. And then when there's a soccer game, then we can talk about Colombia as a country. Or when the Olympics are happening, then Colombia is one thing against the world, right? But the rest of the time, Colombians are all different from each other.
Yeah.
And so these processes of homogenizing or distinguishing between, differentiating or combining, those symbolic processes, that's what I'm interested in studying. What are the historical and political and economic forces involved in combining or separating people and practices and regions of the world? So I think that kind of a process, that's central to the language ideologies literature that I was trained in, or the language ideologies approach that I was trained in, to understand what's happening with regions, the way that you just described, as a fundamentally symbolic process. And language is just one symbolic realm, but there are infinite symbolic realms. So that what's happening, distinguishing between, say, when is it that a language is a dialect, or which dialects are a part of which languages, when is a dialect become a separate language altogether? All of that, those distinctions or those the positioning of two things as the same or as different, that's an ideological process that, that's at the center of my work. There's nothing fundamental about those language practices that makes them the same or different. There's a historical context that needs them to be the same or different. And I'm interested in studying those contexts.
Well, we could go on and on, but I think as a matter of principle, it's 11:35 Central Time. It's 9:35 in the Pacific, and students will have things to do. So we're gonna stop right here, again, knowing that we could still go on for the rest of the day, but I have to be respectful of everybody's time, as much fun as I'm having engaging in conversation with you. But first, I wanted to really express my gratitude to you for sharing this small amount of time with us. I think for the students, they raised a lot of questions, and I think right now they're mind blown with a lot of things to process. So I'm gonna get them time to, because one of the things they have to do is they have to write a position paper based on the question we started with the course. So I imagine a lot of the things you said are gonna be circulating in their minds for the rest of the week. But once again, Jonathan, thank you so much. I mean, it means the world that you, because I know you. I mean, I know that we got so many things to do, especially now with the pandemic. That you spend some time with the students and engage in conversation with them. My appreciation and gratitude for that.
No, thank you, and good luck with all of your work. And I'm excited to remain in touch in whatever ways possible. But good luck with everything.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, and have a very good day. For the rest of the day, and everybody, have a very, very good rest of the day and afternoon.